As I mentioned earlier, political and pragmatic support for economic mobility is declining, just when it's needed most. Huge shifts are taking place in the distribution of income and wealth in this country, but we don't talk about it. It's not part of the presidential debate. And we're not going to talk about it, I believe, because we're very tolerant of economic gaps, more tolerant of these increasing gaps than are citizens of all the other industrialized countries. We are very loath to give up our Horatio Alger dream, the idea that anyone through the dint of hard work is capable of rising to the top of the American corporate pyramid. We're unwilling to re-examine our long-standing belief that hard work alone will lead to economic success, and that each generation is, of course, going to be better off than the last. But the forces of globalization, combined with our decreasing support for social programs, are fraying the American dream and widening the gap between the classes in this country. There's two key influences that causing this widening economic gap, and after we've discussed those, let's talk about then what this gap means for true diversity. First, we have to acknowledge that the centers of economic gravity and of labor are shifting to the industrializing countries away from the industrialized countries. And in this new economic reality, if the U.S. is going to effectively compete, access to education is the most critical factor in our ability to compete, and at the same time, we are shrinking access for lower and now middle-class citizens in this country. Let's look more closely at the first influence, the effects of global shifts in labor and economic growth. Work moves to where the workers are. There's no doubt that the highest quantity of workers can be found in the industrializing world. By the middle of this century, the BRIC countries, Brazil, Russia, India, and China, will have 40% of the world's population, close to 50% of the world's workers. And assuming they avoid geopolitical turmoil, always somewhat of a question, these countries will also eclipse almost all of the current industrialized countries in terms of GDP. The GDP growth is being accelerated by the fact that an ever-increasing proportion of this BRIC labor are receiving college degrees. In the United States, we only focus on the fact that it must be cheap labor, that's why the work is going there. We're missing the fact that they are producing a tremendous quantity of college-educated workers. And at the same time, the BRIC countries are producing college-educated workers in greater and greater numbers. The United States is locked right now into a statistical trend to producing fewer and fewer college graduates over the next years, as is Western Europe and Japan. The greater emphasis on education in growing regions like BRIC makes their labor force attractive for all types of labor. In 2006, there were 3.3 million college graduates in China, 3.1 million in India, and only 1.3 million in the U.S. And granted, they have a larger population to draw from, but every year the proportion of the citizens of the BRIC country who go to college is increasing, and right now, every year, the proportion of our high school graduates who go to college is decreasing. And all of this is happening at a time when the educated workforce will be the critical asset that the United States needs to maintain a competitive edge. According to Secretary of Labor Elaine Chao, the majority of new jobs created in the U.S. over the next decade will require more skills, higher education than we have now, and they will pay above average wages. It's the most critical aspect of labor policy to ensure that workers are able to get the education and training they need to access these growing opportunities. And this is why the lack of support for economic mobility is becoming problematic. Every time we go through an economic transformation in this country, first from agriculture to manufacturing, from manufacturing to intellectual-based services, the gap between what an unskilled worker can make and what a skilled worker can earn has increased. Yes, there's jobs in the services industries with high salaries, but there are many, many more jobs that won't pay much more than a minimum wage if you don't have a college degree. And we can agitate all we want to for increased wages at the low end of the service spectrum, but the simple reality is we are never in this country going to pay middle-class wages to a janitor or a grocery clerk. And as a result, as education declines, the gap between the educated haves and the non-educated have-nots will continue to grow as we become more and more of a service economy. We currently have an unemployment rate of about 5.5%. Not as good as we would like, but still generally close to what we regard as full employment in an industrialized country. But if you analyze the numbers more closely, you see, in fact, a great disparity. The unemployment rate for college graduates is 2%. Unless you live in Michigan or Ohio, if you got a college degree, you can pretty much find a job in this country. For those of us from Michigan and Ohio, we know what we're talking about here. The unemployment rate is over 8% for those who have a high school degree or less. Regardless of race or ethnicity, unemployment rates decline with higher levels of education. And there's a wage premium for that college education, and college-educated workers continue to see their wages increasing. From 1999 to 2005, last set of full data, over the 6 years, college-educated workers saw a 20% real increase in their wages. That was a time that the U.S. was doing well. We were bouncing back from a recovery, so of course that extended to the less educated workers. Well, for those workers with less than a high school diploma, wages increased only 5%. Less than 1% a year. And again, regardless of race or ethnicity or gender, this trend holds true. We have to admit to ourselves that without a college degree, achieving a middle-class lifestyle will increasingly be possible only in limited numbers. And the disparity between what someone can make at each end of the education scale is just going to grow. What happened to the American dream of going to rags to riches? Well, while we talked about it, other countries did things about it. Starting at the bottom of the earnings ladder is now more of a handicap in the U.S. than it is in almost any other industrialized country. Today, only 6% of Americans can make the climb from the bottom income levels to the top in one generation. It's 11 to 14% in the rest of the industrialized world. Why? Because in the U.S., we have a much lower proportion of lower income children having access to education that they need in order to obtain any upward mobility than do any other industrialized country. And as the chasm between the educated haves and have-nots grows, we can expect that gap to continue to increase. The United States now ranks in the bottom half of all the industrialized world in the proportion of students who complete a college degree. And when I say the bottom half, we're near the bottom. So while we can believe our myth of being the highly educated, highly trained, open access to everyone, the facts are you are more likely, if you are born into a lower class income family, you are less likely than anywhere else to be able to climb to the top. You're less likely to get a college degree. And in the U.S. now, almost everyone is less likely to get a college education than they are in the rest of the industrialized world. The lower your family's income, the less likely you are to enroll in or graduate from college or even to graduate from high school. You all in Cleveland and we in Detroit are fighting the battle of our deteriorating quality of urban public schools. And while we are making great individual progress, let's also not deny how far we have to go. If you look at those who leave the 8th grade and you say what percentage of those graduate from high school, it's 28% in Detroit. It's over a third here in Cleveland. These are grim, horrible statistics. We all should be alarmed by them. And as a nation, we should feel compelled to action. We've got to do more to reach this pipeline of students at the very critical juncture between the middle school and the high school. And we have to develop workable alternatives to college, such as trade schools and curricula established in other advanced countries. These alternatives are barely existent here in the U.S. today, leaving limited employment options in the new economy for those who don't have a traditional college degree. So how do we respond as a society? Well, of course, we respond rationally at a time when we need more people attending college. We cut $17 billion in federal support for student loans in 2007. We've let our Pell Grants lose ground to tuition inflation, so today they're only worth half of what they once were. Work-study programs are cut, and for all of our rhetoric about education being a national priority, the alarming high school dropout rates and the growing inaccessibility of a college education aren't even on any of the presidential candidates' top agenda. Now, if I sound biased, perhaps I am, but it's a bias built on personal experience. I grew up at a time when access to food stamps meant whether I could eat or not, where access to government support depended on whether it made it possible for me to go to college. And I have to tell you that when I look at my last income tax return, we all got a pretty good return on the government investment in my education.